I
Yes.
don't think Erdogan will win. I don't think the United States will win, and I don't think Israel, the Israeli regime, will win because the forces that they support are going to have to make very, very tough decisions, and they do not have the capability to run the country with all these problems facing them.
Hello and welcome to the 37th Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that examines the fast changing political and geopolitical economy of our time. The stunningly rapid collapse of the Syrian government in the first week of December was almost universally hailed in the mainstream media and by many others as the defeat of Iran, Russia, China, and other forces representing the cutting edge of the advance of multipolarity and the victory of the forces opposed to this advance, chiefly the United States and Israel. And in this instance, of course, aided by the perfidious Turkey. How much of this is true and how much of this is willful thinking? This is what we are going to examine. I'm Radhika Desai and I'm coming to you today from Istanbul, where I am here at the invitation of Hariji, an important new media organization seeking to report on the ongoing and many-sided transformation of the world order, much as we do here on the Geopolitical Economy Hour. And we've had an interesting time discussing the situation in Turkey and the role that Turkey is playing in it. Sorry, the situation in Syria and the role that Turkey is playing in it, and what to expect in the days and weeks to come. With me to examine this further and to parse the plausible from the hype is Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi, professor of comparative literature, of course, but much, much more besides. As most of you will know, he's among the handful of the most insightful commentators on West Asia, particularly Iran, and also on worldwide developments. Welcome, Professor Marandi.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the very kind words.
Why don't we start off perhaps with a general assessment of the situation in Syria, particularly with what exactly, concretely, is wrong with the assessment that the US and Israel have won and Iran, Russia, and China have lost? Let me just begin by underlining how this interpretation is getting baked in. Even the normally sober and objective Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft concludes about the current situation in Syria as follows. And I will just I will just quote a very brief sentence, a couple of sentences from their recent report. They say the Syrian earthquake emblematizes the dramatic shift in regional power owing to the defeat of the so-called axis of resistance, the amputation of the Shia crescent, and the regional ascendancy of Israel. Although the correlation of regional and external forces might swing in another direction in time, the new dispensation will be the context for the US policy towards Syria in the aftermath of the current crisis. So, Professor Marandi, what do you see is fundamentally wrong with this sort of assessment?
First, I wouldn't call it a Shia crescent. That is something that I think Abdullah II of Jordan coined, or was something that was coined for him. Uh, the axis of resistance was basically created to help the people of Palestine. And the people of Palestine are overwhelmingly Sunni. So it really doesn't make sense for anyone to look at it from that particular perspective or make that sort of coin that sort of term, especially since Syria is not a Shia country. The leadership of Syria was an Alawite, which is different from being Shia. His wife was Sunni, and the party that ruled was the Ba'athist party, which had nothing to do with religion or Shia Islam. So I think that's one problem. But I think there's no doubt that this was a tactical victory for the United States, the Israeli regime, and Erdogan. And I say Erdogan because I don't want to say Turkey or Turkey, because I think it's not a victory for the people of Turkey, and but it is a victory for Erdogan, which I'll point out. And by extension, it is a defeat. It is a tactical defeat for the Axis of Resistance and the Russians as well, and by extension, the Chinese and the global South and so on. But I think while it's impossible to predict the future with the confidence, I think things will probably not remain this way. And there are a host of reasons for this. First of all, the United States has to make a decision about what it's going to do in Syria. Is it going to withdraw completely or not? If it does not withdraw, then it puts a very difficult decision in front, or a difficult problem in front of Julani and Al-Qaeda and I say Al-Qaeda because that's who they are. So HTS is basically Al-Qaeda. So what do? Do they allow the Americans to continue to steal Syrian oil? And send it to the Israeli regime? Do they allow the Americans to continue empowering their proxies in 1/3 of the country? Do they allow the Americans to continue stealing their grain and their wheat and their grains? That is one problem. And this, after the euphoria of Al-Qaeda's victory and its allies, which that is an important point that I'll get to briefly, this is going to become increasingly a problem. Then, of course, there's the issue of Turkey. Until now, Erdogan controlled this organization. He controlled Al-Qaeda and other terror groups. But after this massive victory, and I think it was definitely unexpected for Turkey and for Erdogan, it's not clear how much leverage Erdogan will have over this group, because this group has achieved such success in their own eyes that their stature has risen. Western diplomats are visiting them, and they probably want to have a greater say in running the affairs of their regime. Then there's the issue of the Israeli regime, and that is very problematic. The Israelis have moved forward and taken key areas in southern Syria. They've already occupied, as we all know, the Golan Heights illegally, and they've annexed it. But now they've taken a large piece of territory, over 3 times the size of Gaza, but very strategically located, and they've taken the country's key dam, with huge water reservoirs and the highest mountain. In my opinion, this is a major tactical victory for the Israeli regime in itself. But this causes major problems, and that is that it humiliates the new regime. It humiliates Al-Qaeda, because they keep telling the Israelis that we will not be a launching pad for violence against you, and that, of course, is going to have an impact on the Arab population. It's going to have an impact on the Palestinians, who are gradually going to see that these people, who some of them thought would come and save them, that they have no intention of doing anything against the Israeli regime. But in addition to that, these people will be seen as weaker than the Syrian government was in the face of the Israelis. And the Israelis keep bombing them. The Americans keep bombing them, destroying their infrastructure in a way which we've never seen before. Some of the explosions look like nuclear explosions. They're so massive. this is not going to look good for HTS, and it's not going to look good for Jolani. And in my opinion, this was a major blunder by Netanyahu, because it is in Netanyahu's interests to strengthen this regime. But what he is doing is that he's delegitimizing the regime. And Netanyahu cannot pull back anymore, even if he wanted to, because his coalition partners are definitely saying this is ours now.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a big problem for the Israeli regime, and it's going to be a big problem for Jolani and Erdogan, because all of the bombings that are being carried out against Syria, all of the land grab, people will start looking at Erdogan and saying, well, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to stop this? You didn't do anything for Palestine. You let Gaza be destroyed and you didn't give them a single bullet. Now these are the people that you funded. You've been funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all their affiliates for well over a decade. And what do we have now? So these are all going to be major concerns. In addition to that is the fact that the economic problems in the country are so severe and so massive that they will need stability. And the regime that refuses to recognize the legitimacy of minorities, who together are almost half of the society, Kurds, who are predominantly Sunni, but they have a very different worldview, uh, the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, all of them are going to be fearful of the days and weeks and months ahead.
Absolutely.
So while you have all of these problems, then you have the biggest problem, in my opinion, and that is that HCS is itself a divided organization. But that aside, its allies are very different. They have foreign fighters and Syrian fighters from other groups. Some of them are far more extreme than they are. If Jolani does not abide by the principles that they believe in, then there could be war. They could start undermining him. They could start attacking his troops.
There could be civil
If he
war.
allows the foreign fight,
There could be
sorry?
civil war. There could be civil war.
Yeah, yes. And if he allows the foreign fighters to stay in Syria, then that could cause a lot of problems with the native population, the Syrian people. So if he moves to one extreme, he will be marginalized in one way. If he goes to because remember, even the Syrians, the minorities aside, the Syrian people that I've known for all these years, I've been to Syria many times. And I just passed through Syria from when I came from Lebanon during the war. And I was there for a few days during the summer. Many Syrians do not want HCS. Many Syrians, Sunni Syrians, secular Syrians. I've lectured at the University of Damascus many times. And students, some of them loved Assad, some of them liked Assad, some of them disliked him, and some of them hated him. Of course, they expressed their views cautiously and in a language, but I would understand how they felt. But none of them wanted the extremists that Erdogan was supporting and training and promoting. So if they're going to build Syria, they need to have stability. If they're going to remove the sanctions, they're going to have to put aside a lot of their principles and a lot of their extremism, because not all of their principles are necessarily extremists, but they're going to have to abide by Western Western demands? And will all the different coalition partners and allies of HTS be satisfied? They were at war with each other in Idlib. When they were in that small territory just a month ago, they were the jails were full. They were constantly shooting at each other. It didn't look pretty. Right now, it's going to be a bit quiet because of the euphoria, because of this unexpected victory. I think that their hope was to get close to Aleppo, probably not even take Aleppo. But Aleppo fell, and then they just moved south. And I personally think that Erdogan is very concerned now, and the people around him are very concerned. And the Iranians did the smart thing. They just pulled out. Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, they just sat aside and said, okay, we're not a part of this. So that the troubles that lay ahead are not blamed on anyone but themselves. So I think that, in a sense, in the long run, this could actually be bad news for the Israelis and the Americans.
Yes,
And security-wise, yes.
and this is exactly what I want to explore. I want to pick up on one of the things you said, because I think this is a very key point. Ayatollah Khamenei has said that this had been planned by Israel and the United States for a long time, and many people would agree with him. Many, critics as well as other people, people of all sorts of spectrums of opinion would agree with him. But at the same time, it looks as though, in many ways, you can plan something, but whether everything goes according to plan is another question. In terms of long-term planning, we are also told about the memo that General Wesley Clark was shown, in which there was a list of 7 countries, and the US has been to war now with 6 of them. Great, all of these things are true, and they've probably been planning for a long time. But it seems as though they did not expect to achieve this dramatic victory. And that somewhere along the line, it wasn't just they who were planning. It may also be that the Russians, the Iranians, and the others were also doing their own planning. And what would you say about the speculation that Iran, Russia, and allied forces decided in a certain sense to give what these forces claim to want, and then see what happens? I mean, it's, in a certain sense, be careful what you wish for. And so in a certain sense, what would you say about that? That in a certain sense, the Iranians and the Russians have also, by withdrawing, upset their plans.
I don't believe that that is true for the Iranians, and I doubt that it's true for the Russians. When the Iranians saw that a deal was done and Damascus was going to collapse, the Iranians stood aside because it would have only made things more complicated, and it would have given the Americans and Iran's antagonists excuses to blame Iran for whatever happened in Damascus or elsewhere. The same is true with Hezbollah. The reason why Damascus failed, this will be discussed by people for months to come and maybe even years. But I think one key issue was that the West was successful in hollowing out the economy. They destroyed Syria. They crushed the people of Syria. And this is almost as barbaric as what they're doing to Gaza, because you don't see the starvation, you don't see the bombs, but people are slowly being crushed, for 13 years now, but especially since the Caesar sanctions. So on the one hand, they steal their oil and grain. On the other hand, they keep terrorists in the north that force the Syrian government to focus there and spend money there. The Israelis are constantly bombing them, and people's lives get worse and worse as time goes by. The salary of a general, $40, the salary of a Al-Qaeda terrorist, some of them $2,000. It's just obvious that things will not be able to hold under such circumstances. And people in Iran have been saying that for years, that this, Syria is in a bad place and it's just going to get worse. I don't think anyone expected it to collapse this way and so suddenly, but there's no doubt that the Iranians did not want this to happen. And I highly doubt that the Russians wanted this to happen.
I see.
But I think the Russians and the Iranians played it smart. And the logic that Iran always had and continues to have, and I was just mentioning it uh, uh, last night on Piers Morgan's show. I
I
said
saw
that
that, yes.
the Iranian logic is that whoever was in charge in Damascus, President Assad and his people, were better than Al Qaeda, were better than ISIS. That was worse. Or if you maybe you could say it the other way around. ISIS and Al Qaeda were worse
Yes.
than what was in Damascus. And I think that this is something that people will appreciate more in future. Even the people of Turkey, they will have to face the challenge not only of the economic weight that is going, the economic burden that is going to be their responsibility. True that Qatar will be funding Al Qaeda and the other terror organizations in the days and months, weeks and months ahead, but the cost is very different from Idlib. Now they have to run the country that's broken, and many of the technocrats are aside. Many of the experts are gone, and now they're going to be these terrorists who many of them are just killers who are going to have to make decisions about healthcare, about the economy, about services, about keeping the streets clean. It's not going to be easy, to say the least. There's going to be a huge economic burden. You're going to probably see a rush of refugees coming back to Syria, but then life is not going to get better. I mean, the Qataris can, spread a lot of cash for a while, but that's not going to change the situation. It's just going to act as an aspirin to ease the pain for a while. So, and then there's the cultural burden that's we're going to see that with the euphoria of the terrorists of Al Qaeda and ISIS, because there are remnants of ISIS among them. We've seen the black flags and their affiliates. They are now their supporters are going to be encouraged. It's going to impact Turkey. It's going to impact Saudi. It's going to impact Jordan. It's going to impact Egypt. It's going to impact Western Iraq. So, and if Jolani does not spread his revolution, then he'll be in trouble. If he cooperates with these forces that go beyond Syria's borders, then he'll be in trouble too.
Yes.
Right now, the Chinese, I've spoken to a number of Chinese experts over the last few days who are very concerned about what's going on in Syria. They're very upset. They see this as a threat to Chinese national security, and they're very angry with the Turkish president. So there are very complicated issues that are at play. So I don't believe that the Iranians, for a moment, they were like there was a secret plan to let this happen. But I think that when the Iranians saw that this was inevitable, they were not going to do anything that was just complicate the issue more and cost lives and make and create greater hostility between Iran and the people who are now dominating Damascus.
Yeah. What do you think, obviously we're in this kind of liminal period period between the election in the United States and the inauguration, which will happen at the end of January. And many people would say that in some ways, at least, Biden, whether it is in Ukraine or in West Asia or elsewhere, Biden is maybe trying to create a number of fait accomplis for President Trump. So what are some of your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that's happening? And also, do you think that President Trump, when he's inaugurated, will be pursuing a significantly different line? You know, as we know, on the one hand, it is said about him that he is completely pro-Israel, etc. And of course, there is the whole issue of Gaza and what will happen there and Palestine more generally. And then there are those who say he is very transactional, which sometimes seems to me to be a hopeful thing to me rather than being ideological. So maybe if you could say a few thoughts on, share your thoughts on that.
I can't add anything to the conversation because I think all of what you said is widely debated, and it's I don't have any inside information that would contribute to that. But what I can say is that there is no doubt that Biden is trying to complicate the situation for Trump, and we see that in Ukraine, the sudden rush to give Ukraine um, extra funding and weapons and the ability to continue the war for a bit longer in order to make it more difficult for Trump to come to terms with Russia, in order to make it more costly for Trump to do so, and also to humiliate Trump when Ukraine is ultimately defeated, so that they can say that it was, we kept Ukraine alive and under Trump it fell apart. In our region, I think the same is true. What happened in Syria? If we go back in a bit and recall that Tulsi Gabbard visited President Assad or former President Assad, and her views were very different from the political establishment in the United States, and that's one reason why she's constantly being attacked. I think it's clear that the fall of the Syrian government is not necessarily something that's going to make Trump happy. And Trump did say something interesting about it being a an unwelcome event where Mr. Erdogan was able to take the country. It was an unwelcome takeover by Turkey, or Turkey, but I would say by Erdogan, because I think many in Turkey are very concerned about what's going on. But I think that by complicating the situation in Syria, they want to make things more complicated for Trump. And it's partially due to internal issues, because Trump wants to go after the deep state, the CIA, the FBI, and all the other agencies. He wants to reform the economy in a way which is not going to be good news for Biden supporters or supporters of the Democratic political establishment. And so the more he is stuck with crises outside of the United States, the less energy that he will have to fight or wage war against his enemies at home. And we have to remember that the Republican Party is not on his side on many of these issues. So he owns or controls a faction within the Republican Party, but of course he has more, what should I say, popular, I don't want to say legitimacy, but popular support than anyone else. So that is basically what will carry him. And if he is unable to bring about change, he is going to lose that popularity. And if he engages in war, again, he's going to lose that popularity because he promised not to engage in war. But he has said many dangerous things. Some believe that he is going to intensify conflict with Iran. Actually, I think that it's going to be more difficult now that Syria has fallen. The region is going to be much more complicated for Trump. The spread of extremism is one danger. Syria, to be very blunt, is going to be less of a financial burden for Iran. Iran would constantly send oil to Syria so that people could have electricity. It's going to be less of a burden. Iran will help rebuild Lebanon, but the burden of Syria will no longer be there, and for the time being. And also, Iran's economic relationships with countries across the global south are different from what they were 8 years ago under Trump. The relationship with Russia has evolved, the relationship with China has evolved, with India it's evolving, and with neighbors. And the relationship with countries across the global south are different. And the United States has challenges today that it didn't have back then. So I'm not sure how much ability Trump has to focus on Iran. I'm sure it's going to be challenging for Iran, but I think it's going to be very challenging for the United States. And we have to remember that the war in Ukraine continues as all of this is happening. So the United States cannot focus on Iran, cannot focus on Ukraine, and it cannot focus on China, and it cannot focus on Trump, meaning Trump, on the deep state or the challenges at home, all at the same time, and expect victory and success.
I mean, that's a really vivid description, I think, of what you feel Biden is essentially doing, in a sense, laying traps for Trump. And I think that, that's, very insightful. I have a question, very specific one. I mean, you rightly say that Trump would like to turn the screws on Iran, but there is also an opposite temptation for Trump. I mean, if Trump did manage in his transactional way to try to do some sort of deal with Iran, with a view to perhaps getting a Nobel Peace Prize, because that has eluded him so far. I mean, how serious, how possible is it? And also, if you could comment on where all this, over what has happened over the last 2 or 3 weeks, leaves Iran, the axis of resistance, and the Palestinian cause.
Well, briefly going to Trump, that is also a possibility. Trump, of course, is hated by Iranians for the murder of General Soleimani, who led the war against ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. Fortunately, at least in the case of Iraq, ISIS and Al-Qaeda have no real foothold in most of the country. There's a possibility that the west of Iraq could become unstable, but at least for now, thanks to him, the popular mobilization forces in Iraq were established, the Iraqi army was strengthened. So we have a much stronger Iraq today than we had back then, partially thanks to him, and partially thanks to the resilience of the Iraqi people, and especially those who joined and volunteered to fight against ISIS. So, but Biden has carried out a genocide, a Holocaust in Gaza. Biden has helped slaughter thousands of people in Lebanon. Biden has helped bring Al-Qaeda to power in Syria, according to his own, it's not an admission, he's proud of it, that both Biden and Netanyahu take credit for bringing Jolani to power in Damascus. And I think that is also something that later on, as life gets more difficult in Syria, people will start thinking about more seriously. During the euphoria, many of their supporters will just reject it. But when time goes by, people begin to think more differently, and when the circumstances become very difficult. But so it's difficult to say. If Trump behaves reasonably towards Iran, or more reasonably, the Iranians will reciprocate, even though they despise him for the murder and also for the maximum pressure sanctions,
Yes.
which, by the way, he didn't initiate. They were initiated by Obama. He revived them, or at least he reinforced them or strengthened them. But if he does move in a different direction, without a doubt, the Iranians are not going to behave like children. They're going to reciprocate. But if he moves towards a dangerous situation, if he attacks Iran, then that will lead to a regional war, because all U.S. bases are in the Persian Gulf region. That would mean global oil and gas markets will be in chaos, and that will bring down the global economy. It will bring down the region, but it will also bring down the global economy. And that will be catastrophic for Trump. So hopefully he's not going to make such foolish moves, and countries in the Persian Gulf region, these tiny states, should be pushing very hard to make sure he doesn't make those stupid decisions, such a stupid decision, because the Israelis want this. No one wants a regional war except for the Israelis, except for Netanyahu. So that is something that we have to take into consideration. But the axis of resistance, this has been a setback. There is no doubt about that. This has been a tactical defeat, in my opinion. But Hezbollah has shown its resilience. It will remain the most powerful force in Lebanon. A lot has changed over the last 14 months, because I think people across the region and across the world see Hezbollah in a very different light. In the past, There was a lot of sectarianism directed towards Hezbollah, but the fact that Hezbollah made such sacrifices in the people of Lebanon and the Shia community in particular for Palestinians over the last 14 months, I think that has uh, opened the eyes of many people, even though right now there is a big wave of sectarianism being promoted, and it's for obvious reasons. They want to divide the region. And it's those who are supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria, they are also now promoting sectarianism. But it's the world is very different from what it was in 2012 and 13 and 14. And many people in this region and, of course, beyond the region see Hezbollah for what it is. So Hezbollah's stature has risen dramatically. Hamas has also risen. Its stature has risen. Because after 14 months, the Israelis still haven't been able, they failed on the border with Lebanon. They haven't captured any significant part of Lebanon. They haven't been able to take Gaza. And that is an extraordinary defeat for the regime. In fact, I would say that the Israelis lost the war until they were able to defeat the Syrian government. And that, I think, means that at least militarily, we can no longer say they lost the war. We can say it's a complicated situation. They failed on the battlefield in Lebanon. They failed on the battlefield in Gaza. Remember, in 1982, when they invaded Lebanon, they went all the way to Beirut in days. Mm-hmm. And then they took Beirut. But in 2 months of heavy fighting, they failed to take any major city in Lebanon. And they were the ones who sought a ceasefire. In Gaza, in the past, the Israelis would go all the way to the Suez Canal. But after 14 months, they're still stuck in Gaza. But most importantly, the Israelis have been exposed to the world as a genocidal regime. They've been seen as a regime that's willing to that is carrying out a Holocaust. They can no longer hide behind anti-Semitism or hide behind the Holocaust, because people have now see them for what they are. And people are much more aware than in the past, across the region and across the world. And people across the region hate the Israeli regime in a way in which they, I think that much more than ever before. So this is a big achievement for Hamas, for Islamic Jihad, for the resistance. The stature of Ansar Allah has gone up tremendously because they tried to.
And the Houthis are still around.
Yes, Ansar Allah. That's what I meant. Yes. Or the Houthis, as they call them, Ansar Allah in Yemen. Their stature has risen, and they still impede traffic in the Red Sea that helps the Israeli regime. So. While it is a major setback, no doubt, it's a tactical defeat. But I think if you do see elements of victory, the most important being that the image of Israel has been permanently destroyed, and the West, the collective West, because they've been behind this Holocaust, and it's been carried out live in front of a global audience for 14 months, which is unprecedented in human history. But I think going back to Syria, we have to see how Syria plays out. For me, it's unclear if Israel will really be the victor.
Yes.
I don't think Erdogan will win. I don't think the United States will win, and I don't think the Israeli regime will win, because the forces that they support are going to have to make very, very tough decisions, and they do not have the capability to run the country with all these problems facing them. And I think that is going to ultimately create an evolving situation where maybe in a few months from now, if you and I have a conversation, we'll be talking about a very different set of factors that will be important for the days after our next discussion.
And in fact, exactly, I think that a lot of the points that you have made shows that the different ways in which these actions may boomerang on the United States, on Israel, on Turkey, and so on. Maybe in closing, you might.
And also, just one thing. When people will, and as things get worse in Syria, people will remember increasingly that Erdogan sells oil or transports oil. Him and Aliyev transport oil to Israel. That he
Yes.
refused to break ties with Israel. This is not going to look good
No.
for a brief period of time. Erdogan can, stand as the Sultan and see himself as the emperor, but I don't think that this is going to play out the way he wants.
No. And maybe in closing, if you may want to just reflect a little bit on the role that the Russians can be, the Russians have played and can be expected to play in the near future in the region, and also China.
Well, this is going to push Iran and Russia closer to each other, as these things usually do. And it's, I think, going to make China and Iran cooperate increasingly in the region. I think it's going to cause deep concern in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Jordan and Egypt because they feel very vulnerable. So there will be a price to pay for Mr. Erdogan, and which is very sad because although I think Mr. Erdogan was a good leader for Turkey during his first decade in power, I think since 2011, he's caused a lot of harm to
Interesting.
Turkey, and which is very sad because it's Turkey and Iran are very similar. I don't know if you've traveled to Iran, but if you go to Iran and go to Turkey, you'll see that the culture is very similar because the Sufi tradition in Turkey and Islam in Turkey is very similar to the religious tradition that dominates Iran. And this is, of course, very sharp and very much in contrast, or at least historically, very much in contrast with the values of Al Qaeda and ISIS and these groups. But now, interestingly, for example, Saudi Arabia is going to uh, feel concerned because Saudi Arabia, much more concerned than before, because Saudi Arabia no longer has a crown prince or a king that is seen as the uh, the
Bulwark
godfather
of
of
Islamic.
Wahhabism and Salafism,
Mm.
and Mohammed bin Salman is driving the country towards secularism, inviting dancer women, half naked on stage and concerts, and then you see the Salafists and uh, ordinary people in Saudi saying, "Why didn't we do anything for Gaza?" But that aside, you're going to see the Salafists saying, "Our brothers," or the Wahhabis saying, "Our brothers gained victory in Syria. Maybe it's time to do it here." So there's going to be a lot more, there are a lot of questions
Mm.
uh, with regards to policy and the shifting policy of countries, whether Russia, whether China, well, whether Saudi Arabia or others. And I think I can't say a realignment, but I think it will have an impact on the relationships between these different countries. It could have a positive impact on Iran-Saudi relations. It could have a it will definitely have a positive impact on Iran-Chinese relations, Iran-Russian relations. So we will see these things happen.
And just one quick question, something you said sparked my curiosity. You said that for the first decade, Erdogan had been a great leader, but that after 2011, that somehow things went awry. And I was curious, why did you pick this date? What happened on around this time that you feel reflected a change?
I was in Lebanon in 2011. I was on my sabbatical. So I was there from 2011 to 2012. And I was cooperating with Conflicts Forum, which is run by Alistair Crook. And Alistair Crook was in Pakistan in the 1980s. And he was dealing with the war in Afghanistan between the Soviet Union and the militants, and of course the West and the Saudis and others supporting the groups in Pakistan. And he told me late in 2011 that this is a dirty war. This was before, I think, this was before Cy Hirsch writing about the rat line and about the U.S. What they did in Libya and then sending the weapons to Istanbul and then sending those weapons to ISIS and Al Qaeda, which later became two, ISIS and Al Qaeda and the other groups. He told me that this is a dirty war, and he said the reason is because all the people who used to be in Pakistan are now in Istanbul. All the people who were supporting the different groups in Afghanistan from Pakistan are now supporting the different groups from Istanbul.
Interesting.
And and of course, we know everyone now, but everyone, or at least many people by now, know about Jake Sullivan's email to Hillary Clinton about Al Qaeda being on our side in Syria, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, creating a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. US and its allies were doing that, which was ISIS. John Kerry saying that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus, that leaked
So,
audio.
so
We
things,
know all these things now.
yeah.
So the dirty war in Syria was, I think, the moment when Erdogan took a very different direction, wasted a lot of money in Syria, destroyed so much of Syria, killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians because he was pursuing a policy that he wasn't leading. The Americans were behind it,
Yes.
and they continue to be behind it because we know that he's very vulnerable. You do remember the pastor who he arrested and accused of being a part of the coup, and then the Americans threatened sanctions, and he submitted. He kneeled. So he is very vulnerable to the Americans. But I think that ever since 2011, we do see a shift in culture in Turkey. When I travel to Istanbul, I notice that in some areas, people tell me, you should not go there, it's not safe. Uh, and economically, he's hurt Turkey, and he's hurt Turkey's relations with different countries. Some people say that he's very smart and that he constantly shifts and moves. But and maybe in the short term, that's a good policy. But in the long term, that creates distrust. And
Yes.
Mr. Erdogan is now known by everyone, all politicians, all the world leaders, that he's just not someone you can trust. And I don't think that's a good thing for Turkey.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Marandi. You've given us so much to think about, and I think that as you say, we should be talking about this months from now, and we will be talking about some very different things as things shift. And I hope we will be talking. And in the meantime, thank you very much. And yeah, what can I say? Your insights are always so helpful.
You're very kind. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.